Welcome to story time. Today we will finish our book about Peter Cottontail or Peter Rabbit. And remember, Peter is wanting to hibernate, but he's having trouble getting fat enough. Because remember, he needs to be fat to stay warm, but he's having a hard time finding food, so he just runs around a lot to find food. But then, remember, running around burns off fat, so then he's not getting fat. So let's see what happens to finish the book. Chapter 25 is called Unc' Billy Possum Plays a Joke. Some folks never seem to be satisfied or quite content, always wanting something more that for them was never meant. Unc' Billy Possum said this to himself as he watched Peter Rabbit hurrying about through the green forest and over the green meadows, eating as fast as ever he could so as to grow fat that he might keep warm while he slept all winter. Now Unc' Billy Possum knew perfectly well that Peter Rabbit couldn't sleep all winter as Johnny Chuck does, for Old Mother Nature had never planned that Peter should. But Unc' Billy knew that it was of no use to tell Peter that, for Peter wouldn't believe him. So he chuckled as he watched Peter rush around, hunting for food and actually running off what little fat he did have, instead of putting on more. Of course, it just happened that Unc' Billy Possum was right over near the old house built by Grandfather Skunk a long time ago, which Peter Rabbit had decided to sleep in all winter. It just happened that he saw Peter when he finally went down to the little bedchamber at the end of the long hall to curl up and try to go to sleep. Unc' Billy grinned, then he chuckled. Finally, he laughed until his fat sides shook. "I reckon I'm going to have some fun with Brer Rabbit," said Unc' Billy, still chuckling as he trotted off through the green forest. He went over to Bobby Coon's house and found Bobby, who had been out all night, just getting ready for bed. But Bobby is always ready to play a joke, and when Unc' Billy told him about Peter Rabbit and what fun it would be to give Peter a scare, Bobby scrambled down from his hollow tree right away. Then they hunted up Jimmy Skunk, and the three started for the old house of Grandfather Skunk, where Peter Rabbit was trying to go to sleep for the winter. "I done tell Peter that when he tried to go to sleep, he mustn't get to thinking about what would happen if Brer Fox should just happen along and find him asleep. I reckons that is the very first thing Peter did think of, as soon as he curled himself up, and that he's thinking of it more'n ever right this blessed minute. Y'all's wait while I listen at the door." Unc' Billy stole very softly to the door of the old house. Do you know what it means when it says he stole very softly to the door? He's not stealing things. If it's used that way, it means that he went really quietly. Then he began to grin and beckoned to Bobby Coon and Jimmy Skunk to come listen. They could hear long sighs from way down in the bedchamber at the end of the long hall. They heard Peter twist and turn as he tried to make himself comfortable. But when they heard him saying a verse over and over to try to make himself go to sleep, they had to clap their hands over their mouths to keep from laughing out loud. When they grew tired of listening, Unc' Billy whispered to Jimmy Skunk. Jimmy Skunk grinned, and then he crept a little way down the long hall and began to scratch with his stout claws as if he were digging. When he stopped, Unc' Billy put his mouth down close to the doorway and barked as nearly like Reddy Fox as he could. Then Jimmy began to dig again, and pretty soon Unc' Billy barked again. Then all three stole softly away and hid behind some bushes. "I reckon Brer Rabbit is right smart wide awake instead of going to sleep for the winter," chuckled Unc' Billy. All right, last chapter, 26. Peter Rabbit learns his lesson. Peter Rabbit, curled up in the little bedchamber at the end of the long hall in the old house made a long time ago by Grandfather Skunk, twisted and turned and tried to make himself feel sleepy. But the harder he tried, the more wide awake he seemed to feel. Then he began to think of Reddy and Granny Fox and what would happen if by any chance they should find him there fast asleep. And right while he was thinking about it, he heard a noise that made him jump so that he bumped his head. Peter didn't think anything about the bump on his head. No, sir, Peter didn't even notice it. He was too frightened. He held his breath and listened, while his heart went pit-a-pat, pit-a-pat. There it was again, that noise he had heard before. Someone was in the long, dark hall. There was no doubt about it. He could hear claws scratching. Whoever it was digging. Digging! The very thought made every hair on Peter Rabbit stand on end. He knew that Johnny Chuck had gone to sleep for the winter. He knew that Jimmy Skunk could walk right in without any trouble, and that Jimmy never takes any trouble that he can avoid. He knew that Bobby Coon and Unc' Billy Possum don't go into houses underground, unless they have to get away from danger, and very seldom then. If someone was digging in the long dark hall, it could mean but one thing, that it must be someone too big to get in without making the hall larger, and the only ones he could think of were Bowser the Hound and Reddy and Granny Fox. Peter shivered and shook, for unlike Johnny Chuck's house, this one had no back door. If it's Bowser the Hound, he may get tired and go away. Anyway, I can soon tell, for he will sniff and snuff and blow the sand out of his nose, thought Peter, and he strained his ears to listen for the first sniff. But there were no sniffs or snuffs. Instead, Peter heard a sound that made his heart almost stop beating. It was a bark that sounded very much like the bark of Reddy Fox, and it came from just outside the door. That could mean but one thing, that old Granny Fox was digging her way into the little bedchamber while Reddy kept watch outside. But we know what was actually going on. Oh dear, why wasn't I content to live as I always have lived? Whatever did I try to do something I never was intended to do for? Cried Peter to himself, and shook with fright harder than ever. There was nothing to do but to sit still and wait. Peter sat as still as ever he could. After a little while, the noise in the long dark hall stopped. Peter waited and waited, but all was still, and he began to feel better. Perhaps old Granny Fox didn't know that he was there at all, and had grown tired of digging and had gone away. Peter waited a long time and then peeped out into the long hall. Way up at the end, he could see light where the doorway was, and by this he knew that no one was in the hall. Little by little, his heart going pit-a-pat, Peter crept up until he could peep outside. No one to be seen. With his heart almost in his mouth, Peter sprang out and started for the dear old briar patch as fast as his long legs could take him. And then he heard a sound that made him stop suddenly and sit up. Ha, 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 ho, 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 hee, hee, hee. There, behind some bushes, Unc' Billy Possum, Bobby Coon, and Jimmy Skunk were laughing fit to kill themselves. Then Peter knew that they had played a joke on him, and he shook his fist at them. But down in his heart he was glad, for he knew that he had learned his lesson, that he had no business to try to do what Old Mother Nature had never intended that he should do. Of course, these are not all of Peter Rabbit's adventures. Oh my, no. There are so many other little people who live on the Green Meadows and in the Green Forest who have adventures too, and get into funny scrapes, that I am sure you will be willing to say goodnight to Peter for a little while and hear about the things that have happened to some of the others. And so, in the next book, I am going to tell you about the worries and troubles and exciting escapes of one of Peter's friends, Unc' Billy Possum. The end. Now, I don't think that we're going to read Unc' Billy Possum, but I don't know, your family might have some of these books, so you could see if your mom or dad or one of your older siblings could read them to you. They're probably still a little bit hard for you to read yet, but if you keep on practicing your reading, I bet pretty soon you might be able to start reading some of your own books, some bigger books, chapter books like that. All right, I hope you enjoyed hearing about Peter Rabbit's adventures.